Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hi, I'm Luke Moffett, Senior Lecturer here at the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast, researching on reparations and victims in transitional societies. And so today we're joined by Dr James Gallen from Dublin City University, who's one of the leading experts on institutional abuse and transitional justice. And so today we're hoping to have a bit of a conversation around some of these issues, and James can speak to his expertise in this area.
Thanks, Luke. It's great to be here. So originally my research interest was in transitional justice, which as typically understood involves either post-conflict or post-authoritarian societies. But in recent years, a number of wealthy consolidated democracies have started to investigate widespread or systemic crimes of their past. And both scholars, activists and governments are now using transitional justice as both a discourse and an evaluative tool to consider how best to respond to legacies of past violence. So for the last, 30 years, countries in the common law world or the English-speaking world have been looking at legacies, particularly of residential institutions. Where various categories of people who were seen as being vulnerable or in need of social protection were housed. But despite these noble intentions, ultimately these groups were subject to quite severe human rights violations. So we can see this kind of trend emerging from Canada, the United States, Australia, the Scandinavian and Nordic countries, and in Ireland and the United Kingdom as well. So we've seen a real proliferation of investigations into these forms of harm, starting with child sexual abuse and the physical abuse of children, and now extending into more complex and diverse forms of harm. So we're looking at issues such as the forced adoption of children, forced medical experimentation, forced medical procedures such as symphysiotomy, across a range of jurisdictions. And I suppose transitional justice is adding value by trying to provide coherence to this process and give some sort of shared themes to what can seem quite a confusing and diverse range of political and legal processes.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have, heard in the news different stories and issues that came out, but maybe for those people who aren't familiar, and even from talking to you in the past, and maybe want to talk about the scale, which even I've found surprising, and even just in the Republic of Ireland.
Yeah, so what attracted me to the area first was the intuition that these crimes had occurred in a systematic fashion. So there was some degree of either design or willful neglect in terms of the scale of abuse of children and vulnerable people, and then that this pattern was replicated across a number of jurisdictions. So in the Irish context, the Ryan report, which looked at investigations into abuse in residential schools, industrial and reformatory schools, says the abuse was endemic. So the numbers of children involved is about 300,000 over a 50-year period. About 1,000 adult survivors of child abuse gave testimony to that commission. And that's mirrored then in other arenas as well. Investigations into clerical sex abuse in sort of non-residential settings, diocesan settings, demonstrates the abuse is widespread. There's a practice of moving abusers around that occurred nationwide, and indeed we see abusers being moved from one jurisdiction to another, the most famous example being Father Brendan Smith abusing in at least 3 jurisdictions. So I wrote a piece a number of years ago that suggested the abuse should be viewed globally as being part of a widespread and systemic process, particularly because this abuse often has emanated from a combination of state and church-run institutions, and particularly in higher levels of church hierarchy, that there would have been awareness or notice of this abuse taking place and a failure to respond to that or to manage that, and in some instances actions undertaken to cover up such abuse demonstrate that it's widespread and systemic. So one estimate shows on the child abuse alone that we're speaking about 100 to 200,000 victims globally within the 20th century. If we were to extrapolate that further in terms of the type of abuse experienced by Aboriginal peoples in Canada and Australia, we're moving up again into multiples of hundreds of thousands. In regards to other forms of abuse, so the arbitrary detention and forced labour of individuals. The minimum figure in the Irish context, for instance, of women detained in Magdalen laundries is 14,000 or so, which is contested by the civil society groups. There's a current inquiry investigating practices in mother and baby homes. And one allegation that's been made in that setting is that at least 3,000 children have been forcibly or illegally adopted to the United States from Ireland without the consent or the meaningful consent of their mothers. So it's not a small-scale process, even if these figures are historically contested or challenged, which is one of the kind of key themes, I think, in investigating something that's occurred so long in the past. So it could be upwards of 50, 60 years, particular instances of abuse. So even if people quibble with the figures, it's plausible given the degree of correlation and the degree of sort of support for these testimonies that we're talking something that's really significant. And to my mind then really goes to the core of what Western consolidated states, so Britain, Ireland, Canada, the US, the core of their national identity. These are, to borrow religious language, part of the original sin of these jurisdictions, particularly their founding myths in a post-colonial setting. And it's key to me, I think, that we have a meaningful national conversation around these issues that doesn't just stop at saying, well, the church is bad, so we'll stop going to mass and that's the end of the issue, but rather says, well, to what extent was society responsible for these issues as well as institutions and individuals? And to what extent have we learned from these mistakes, or are we in fact repeating forms of exclusion, shaming, and forms of harm today? So a number of weeks ago, I attended a memorialisation event at the last remaining Magdalen laundry in Dublin on Sean McDermott Street, and after a number of elderly former residents had given their testimony, a young woman of African origin got up and said, well, I'm living in direct provision in Ireland, and so Ireland is still institutionalising and excluding people that it sees as social problems. They're just out of sight, out of mind. And obviously the two issues and contexts are widely different, but to my mind, it really demonstrates that if we don't learn socially and politically from the failures of the past and the harms of the past, then we are at serious risk of repeating them in the future. And I think unlike in mainstream transitional justice settings where you might have very large national conversations about political violence, about the role of the state and the rights and wrongs of conflict, the discussion around historical institutional abuse has been remarkably quiet in terms of asking these bigger national questions. And I'm concerned with that quietness because I think it reinforces the control of shame or the control of contempt that seem to be an influencing factor in creating these harms, that people placed children, placed women in institutions because they were ashamed that they didn't fit a set of cultural assumptions about what a family should look like or what religion expected of a family. So single mothers were excluded. Women who were seen as sexually promiscuous without motherhood were detained in Magdalen laundries or in mother and baby homes. So there's a whole range of very personal and very deep cultural reasons and baggage that I think if we don't talk about, we'll really miss an opportunity to honour those who've suffered and respect their experience and learn from their experience, but also to transform as a society and as a culture on these issues. So for me, looking at these issues through a transitional justice lens gives you the toolkit to assess the interests of states in dealing with these issues. Do they want to maintain the status quo and placate those who are advocating for change? Do they want to engage in more transformative behaviours, reform their own institutional structures, their relationship with other organs of power? And how is this manifested in law and in political expression, political apology, and so on? And how is this manifested socially? How are people organising themselves to deal with these issues, and how is that being either supported from civil society or being curtailed as well? So there's a whole range of issues, I think, which makes it a really ripe context, but also a very urgent context, because the people involved are very elderly. And unfortunately, people are often dying before they see what they consider to be justice. A quote from a gentleman looking for his mother, who he believed was in a mother and baby home recently, saying, "I don't want to come in contact with the gravestone. I want to come in contact with a real person and have that relationship for however long it lasts." So, although these issues are very historic, they're also very timely for the people affected.
Yeah, yeah. That really sort of captures the scale just in one country and the challenges they're in. And even in Northern Ireland, in terms of trying to deal with, like, in a small country, we've had the historical institutional abuse inquiry, and we've done that, but the recommendations for that haven't been properly implemented. And there's been victims there who've recently been calling for it and have died before seeing anything done, even just in a few months. What in Ireland is being done now that this is coming to light in trying to deal with the scale of this harm?
So what tends to have happened in Ireland, and it's replicated elsewhere, is because of the scale being so large, states have both justifiably and perhaps in their own interests adopted a piecemeal approach. So it's been to focus on specific institutions for inquiry and for forms of redress, such as compensation or acknowledgement. So we've looked, starting off at child sexual abuse in a residential setting, then we examined it in a clerical diocesan setting, moved to examining the forced labour and detention of women in Magdalen laundries, and currently looking at the mother and baby home issue. So it's institution by institution. And there's been a very uneven process with that. Some of those inquiries have had public hearings, have had significant resources attached to them. But if we look at the trend over time, so the Ryan inquiry being the first, each of the inquiries has got successively cheaper, and the nature of the process has become successively more private and more controlled by the Irish state. So there's been less participation and ownership of victims and survivors. So on the one hand, you can appreciate the need to break this up into sort of manageable chunks from an institutional perspective. But on the other hand, there is a risk, I suppose, that people become increasingly dissatisfied with a closed process. And there's also a risk that those pieces don't tell the whole story. So in my work, I've come across a number of individuals who have suffered multiple forms of harm from multiple forms of institutions. It may be that somebody was growing up in an industrial or residential school, became 18, went to a Magdalen laundry, suffered sexual violence, became pregnant, went to a mother and baby home. And so they might be someone who experiences the full range of historical institutional abuse. And that story doesn't get captured or isn't presented, I think, in the way we're telling it at present. And as a result, I think there is a concern among advocates that the public perception or the history might record a series of discrete institutions that dealt with various different groups, that never the two should meet, whereas the lived experience of the people concerned that I've met and dealt with seems to suggest that actually these things interacted. Sometimes they shared the same physical site, sometimes they were closely proximate and had significant correspondence and cooperation. So I think that's important. The other thing that's distinctive about how states have dealt with this issue is it's often been without acknowledgement, and Ireland would fit within this, of their legal responsibilities. So Ireland has had a redress board scheme since 2002 for residential schools, but it's an ex gratia scheme, so it's without admission of legal responsibility. And it's replicated that model on smaller scales for other forms of abuse. So we had a Quirk scheme after Justice Quirk in the Magdalen context, a brief scheme for survivors of the medical procedure of symphysiotomy, and all of these forms of compensation payments to victims and survivors are without admission of the fact that anybody, I think, did anything wrong. So there's a political separation of questions of apology or questions of responsibility from an administrative process that offers people a form of cash payment to acknowledge in some limited way their experience. And when teaching, I describe this as sort of one of those fake apologies you may give to your friends, which is to say, I'm sorry if you feel bad. I'm sorry if you think that way, rather than I'm sorry, it was my fault, I should have prevented the harm from taking place, and this is to acknowledge my failure. So my concern would be that we will have spent 30 years, billions of euro, and will be left with a process that does not satisfy victims and survivors, does not impact on society more generally, and leaves the state and church apparatus largely untransformed, but also dissatisfied with having to go through this process. So it seems to be one that risks not benefiting any one constituency to any great extent. And I think that would be an awful waste of time and energy.
Yeah, no, that's a really good capture of what's going on. And I suppose you've written a lot on this, and particularly I really enjoyed your article in the International Journal of Transitional Justice called Jesus Wept. It's very powerful and sort of tease out some of these debates. I think maybe as a finishing point, is there anywhere where people who are interested in this should find out more information, or anywhere you would direct them to, any sort of resources on that?
I think what I would encourage people to do is to promote the voices of those who've been ignored for so long. So to do that, I would encourage them to seek out the voices of victims and survivors, and to do so, look for those groups online who are reflecting their stories today. So there's a number of avenues for doing that. There's a Justice for Magdalene's group, which is collaborating with the Adoption Rights Alliance on a project called the CLAN, Irish word for family project, designed to help women who were in institutional settings tell their story in a collective way, so that whatever the outcome of the ongoing Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes, there is a collective oral history and narrative there. I would encourage people to seek out the survivor groups for clerical sexual abuse and look at their data and their reports nationally. So 1 in 4 in the Irish context, and internationally as well, to show the scale of the issue. So the Survivors Network of those abused by priest, or SNAP, which people might be familiar with from the Spotlight movie, have wonderful resources that show kind of the diverse national experiences and the central role of religion in the Catholic Church in this setting. And I think just to read widely, because these issues come up periodically in the press, whether it's the HIA in Northern Ireland or TUM, for instance, in the Republic, but to try and consistently look at these issues, because I think the risk is that we have moments of outcry or of hysteria, and then we go back to our lives unchanged. And I think the opportunity is for us to use those moments to really consider what type of country we are and countries we are, and what steps we can take to change that.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think it's a wider problem in transitional justice, because it's about the struggle. So the struggle for those who are marginalised, forgotten, victimised, to get acknowledgement and sort of awaken society that it doesn't happen again, and maybe to alleviate some of the suffering that has been caused. So thanks so much, James. That has been incredibly comprehensive and engaging, and we'll hope to have you back up soon in Belfast.
Thanks very much for your time. Cheers.
Thanks.
You have been listening to LawPod, an informed take on current events brought to you by the law students and staff at Queen's University Belfast. This episode was produced by Richard Somerville and Rachel Gallen. Our theme music is by Colonel Chocolate and the Justice Triangle, and we are funded by Queen's Law School and the Queen's Annual Fund. Thanks to Luke Moffett and James Gallen for this episode. You can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram at QUB LawPod. You can also find us on iTunes and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. I'm Rachel Gallen. This was LawPod.